1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Perth-based wine critic Erin Larkin. Erin covers Australia and New Zealand for The Wine Advocate, a hugely influential global publication. We talked about fashioning tasting notes with an haute couture aesthetic, early adventures in bottle shops, the merry-go-round of generosity, where to find wonder in Western Australian wine, and bearing the burden of being a world-famous reviewer. I started by asking Erin about her upbringing in Perth, WA.
I was born in a pretty low-class suburb in Perth back in 1986. And my parents were very young when they had me, married, in love, and kind of spent my childhood buying old houses, renovating them, selling them, and moving to another old house, renovating that and selling it again. So I suppose the main part of my childhood was near the beach, which definitely wasn't the low-class place that we started, and was a really incredible upbringing, actually, a very kind of loving childhood. We spent a lot of time at the local bushland with our dog, my sibling, and it was fun. It was easy, you know. My mum was a lawyer and my dad worked in human resources for the West Australian government, and the pair of them had a good life together. They broke up when I was at the end of primary school, and we then sort of evolved into high school in, a different part of Perth. And I remember thinking it at 16 that I'd probably lived in about 16 houses by that time. So there's a lot to be said for moving all of the time and not having really permanent roots in any one place. When I was in school, I loved English and art was always the thing that I was always going to do. I never really considered anything else. Mum and Dad had good careers in jobs that were really academic, and both of them had said, pursue what you love and do what makes you happy because money will come. But there was a long period during my job, having followed that advice initially, thinking, that was shit advice because I'd love to be a lawyer and have lots of money, you know, but I'm really glad that they raised us like that. It was very much an environment of you can do whatever you want in whatever field you want. You just have to make sure that you love it. So that was kind of my early life, I suppose. And that set me up, what I now know, set me up to approach things in from a very left of centre perspective. I really have never felt like there's any boundaries to what I can do, and there's never any restrictions to that. So that fits in very well with the West Australian ethos. I think that within Australia we're very much, you know, wow, WA is so far away, and, you know, we're kind of not part of the main country. And I think that underdog perspective really shapes a lot of the attitudes here. And I think that there's a lot of very ambitious people in Perth because there's no rules here. It's not like you were born into a certain type of family and therefore you can't excel. It's just a matter of skill will provide you with the opportunities that you need to succeed. So yeah, all of that kind of shaped my early thinking around how to proceed in life, I suppose, from a career perspective. And it led me into fashion.
Tell me more about the fashion career. What was it that you showed an aptitude for in that side, or what was it creatively that really gave you a bit of a buzz?
It's always been about making things and understanding how things go together and the materiality of them, which now in wine is absolutely central to the way that I craft tasting notes and perceive wine. But in the early days, it was just about making stuff. And so I got my first sewing machine at 13 and was always doing and making. I made lots of my own clothes and participated in lots of competitions and was really just like quite proactive about fashion. Then did a visual art degree, majored in textiles, did most of that but didn't finish it, moved from there to fashion and finished that. That was a hugely intensive and really great part of my life. Paid lots of my way through uni by dressmaking, and so I made lots of Irish dancing costumes, wedding dresses, ball gowns, all of that kind of thing, stuff at craft stores on the weekends. And it really was my life. It was everything I was ever going to be. I was never going to be in any other industry other than art and fashion.
That's really cool. Just out of curiosity, when you were growing up by the beach in Perth, more I guess in the early 90s, were you quite outdoorsy? Were you ever a sort of little scruffy neighbourhood larrikin type, or were you always quite glamorous?
No. My mum was from Halifax and she was raised with the attitude that if the sun is shining, you're outside. And I think anyone born in the 80s and the early 90s will remember growing up at that time, we were not restricted like we are now in terms of safety and stranger danger and all that. Mum and dad were like, get outside, bye. So we made a big group of friends in the neighbourhood and we'd all go and play together for most of the day. If we had the weekend off, we had a pool there, we'd go to the beach. It was really a wholesome outside childhood. I think I was always interested in shoes and clothes and jewellery. That never has changed.
So one of the more glamorous larrikins on the block, effectively.
Yeah.
And I have picked up on a couple of your posts on social media about your mother. She strikes me as having been a really formative part of your ethos in life. You spoke about that upbringing already, but she was a really creative and social person as well.
Oh, that's such a nice thing for you to have said. My mum was amazing. She and I were very, very close. She was very clever, very quick and very creative. So she was a singer, played piano and guitar and anything else that kind of came her way. But her biggest skill, I think, was her words. And so she passed away at the end of 2023 from Alzheimer's at 59. But right up until, towards the end, she was still able to spell words for me that I was having trouble with, or I could say, Mum, what does this mean? And she'd still be able to tell me. She never shied away from using big words with us as kids. And so we'd then have to ask, what does that mean? And so you'd learn, these kind of interesting and useful words. It was a really huge part of my upbringing and I loved it. I really loved it. It's kind of fed my desire to craft tasting notes now because each one of them is like a little verbal vignette. It's like a beautiful thing that I fold neatly and then kind of just send down the river of review, hoping that someone will read it.
And what kind of student were you at school? Were you quite conscientious in those sort of structured environments as well?
Yeah, I was a bit of a goody two-shoes, I think. Yeah, I did 6 TE subjects, which is now ATAR or whatever it's called. They were all humanities except for the one maths that I just did to get through. Actually, I was talking to my husband about that this morning. The only complicated maths I was ever any good at was trigonometry because it dealt with angles. And angles was something that I was always working with in fashion for pattern making. And so visually, because I'm a visual word person, that was something I could get my head around. But like algebra and the other stuff, I'm like, was not my area.
And so when did wine sort of rear its head? Was that something you were around through your teens?
No, not really. Dad had a interest in wine and beer and flavour always from when I was little. So I do recall in that house by the beach at that nice time, the only way I could get away with getting up at night time without going back to bed was if I went down to Dad's cellar and helped him do jobs. I'd cut out little tags to go on the ends of all the bottles so that he could put drinking windows on them, and that was a job I was allowed to do. But otherwise, wine was very much not, Mum drank wine and enjoyed it very much, but it was never a part, like the quality side of things and the people aspect of it and the place aspect of it, the stuff that I now love, that was never part of the way I was raised. And it wasn't until I got a job at a bottle shop, a part-time job to just cover my rent because fashion was pretty tough. I'd gone full-time freelance as a stylist and it was going great, but it was, if you're managing clients that don't pay, it's hard, right? So I got a job at a bottle shop and I was like, I like this. I like it a lot. My brother-in-law at the time, who I'd been to high school with, he was like, mate, you got to do the ordering. And I was like, the only thing I know about wine is that people know a lot about wine and I don't really, which is kind of stressful. So I called every rep that we had on the books and I said, if you are passing my shop, I need you to come in and bring the wines into me and let me taste them so I can at least understand what I'm buying and why I'm buying it. And that became a really big thing for me. Like I was tasting every day and learning stuff all the time and listening to reps talk to me about what they saw in the wine or why it was important. They'd bring winemakers through and I'd talk to them as well. And I was just really naive, really open and not scared and kind of keen, because for me, I always belonged in fashion. I was never going to belong in wine. And so there was never any risk to me asking questions that sounded stupid, because what's the problem with that?
Yeah, that's interesting though, because it's not, I would say, an instinct that a lot of people follow. Having that, I guess, responsibility to understand context is not necessarily, I would say, something that comes to everyone, if their skin's not really in the game. As you say, you had nothing to lose, so your attitude was that you may as well learn, whereas some people would think it the other way around.
The thing about fashion that allowed me to think that about wine is that it's a really creative and wonderful industry, and I love Now I still love fashion deeply, but it didn't give me the opportunity to stretch myself intellectually. And so wine does that, because you have to know things about chemistry and biology and geology, and you have to know about people, and you have to understand and remember all of that stuff. And then the next year you have to learn it all again. And so that is endlessly titillating for me. And that, I think, is part of why I liked it so much, because I remember thinking, oh, I think I might have a handle on the 2010 vintage. And then 2011 rolled around and I was like, shit, I have to learn it all again, because it's not the same thing. So that was sort of what got me hooked. And that was about when it was, 2011. Yeah.
And whereabouts was that bottle shop that you first started in?
In Bayswater in Perth, Liquor Barons Bayswater.
And how long did that last?
Well, they were great years, but I think there was only 2 years there. I think there was 2 years, but it was awesome. It was awesome. We went from being, the guys that owned the bottle shop were event promoters. So they started Big Day Out and a couple of other really big festivals. And so we would also run the bar stock through the shop. Plus we owned a theatre in Perth called the Astor. And so the bar for the Astor would go through the shop as well. So we always had bands and riders and stuff that needed completing outside of the usual bottle shop responsibilities. So it was kind of super fun. And we changed it from being a bottle shop that dealt with that mainly to being a wine-focused store, craft beer store. We did tastings every week. It was it was a great time of life. It's carefree.
Did you find that you were getting a bit of a kick out of those interactions with reps coming by, showing you wines to buy? The fact that you could ask questions and that they probably were relatively happy to provide information and be spoken to that way. And did you then find that talking to customers, that you were giving them something that was letting them leave the shop with a bit more of a spring in their step?
Yeah, I loved it, because what I did in fashion as a stylist, you have to consume and digest everything that you see, from current collections to other stylists' work to runway shows, other editorial work, even advertorial stuff. So you've really got to be consuming it all of the time to understand what the landscape's like. But then when you as a stylist create work, what you're doing is you're distilling all of that consumption into a body of work, whether it's a runway show, an editorial spread, whatever. And so in wine, I saw it as very much the same thing. It was my job to taste everything, try everything, ask all the questions, understand what was happening, and then say to people, by the way, I've tasted 50 wines and these are the 5 that you've got to try. So to me, the job was very the same. It was just with a different subject matter. And that's kind of the bridge between the two for me, because both of them came from the same part in my solar plexus of just like, God, I love this. So it was easy in that way, albeit with some skills to learn.
The way that you describe your writing, producing these vignettes, is that you're actually taking quite a lot of stuff and actually producing something at the end of the day as well, like adding value to it that way. Is that something that you feel that you're doing? When
you do something, when you perform in a way, like as feedback after this podcast project that you have, if someone has sat down and consumed it and understood it and then says to you, I think it's really good, and I think it's really good for these reasons, the pleasure that you will get from hearing that very specific assessment of your work is a gift in itself, and hopefully an opportunity for you to learn how to improve it, but mainly just a really wonderful thing for you to experience. And so wine reviews, I try to be critical, because that's the job. I do have to say it's good, or it's not as good as it could be, or it's not very good at all. But also there is a part of it that's just immortalizing the wine that these people have made. I was tasting with Torbreck the other week, and I was listening to winemaker Ian Hongel talk to me about the season that was and the vineyards that are. And he had little snippets of things that he said, and I kind of wove responses to those things into the tasting notes. Now, no one else might get those little references, but he will, and he and his team made those wines. And so when he reads that note, that little bit is to him. And I do that to all the wines if I can, give something personal back to the person that made the wine, because it's a joy and a pleasure to be able to do it. So
yeah, and I do think it adds another dimension to the work, whether that be feedback for the producer or something that gives a consumer a little more insight into what a wine is going to give them, other than just a score and flavours of X, Y, and Z.
But it's about why. For me, it's about why. I was in Paris recently and I was talking to Ian Beckett, MW, who is from the World of Fine Wine mag, and he's just one of the world's great gentlemen. And we were talking about the difference between writing a tasting note that talks about the way something tastes and writing a tasting note about why it tastes like that. And for me, I'm much more interested in creating a note that tells you why it tastes like that. So you might say it's got a whole bunch in it, and you can see that in the wine because it tastes like this, not just 5% whole bunches and a list of flavors. It doesn't take a lot more to weave one into the other, but when you read it, it makes more sense in the mouth. And that's the whole point to me, is trying to decode what we have in the glass and hopefully create something beautiful, like a beautiful piece of writing in the process of that.
And you're also probably saying something about how it makes you feel, which I think is really important. And I think that is where that universe that you kind of spoke of, that you're consuming, internalizing, digesting, interpreting, and then creating something with this new information that you're processing side by side. And you actually are communicating something more than that static thing, but a much more moving story.
But there's a fine line between emotion and fluff. And so I try and cut it off before it gets fluffy. We're all evolving, right? We all grow and get better at what we do every day that we do it. And there are tasting notes I've written in the past. I'm like, wow, that's way too fluffy. Should have cut that short. But that's how you learn, is the cringe that you feel when you read something a couple of years later and you're like, wow, I was really still evolving that particular skill set. But yeah, I try and snip it before it gets fluffy, because that really reduces the amount of people that care about it.
I want to talk a bit more about your life as a critic, because I think that is really interesting to people. And there's obviously a sphere that is evolving at the moment, but also a very interesting and quite crowded field, I guess. First of all, one more question, I guess, that harks back to fashion is whether your fashion instincts are still part of, from a luxury point of view, the way that you view wine.
I think that if you're approaching wine from a perspective of, I want to collect all of the beautiful things, I can understand it, because people do that in fashion, but that's not how I do it. What fashion taught me was an aesthetic appreciation for beautiful things and for crafted things. And so the wines that I love, the wines that I'm just like, wow, I can't get enough of that, are the wines that speak to me about work and detail, definition, distinction. And often that is the fancy brands, but it's not always. And I actually love it when people send me wines that I haven't heard of before or haven't tasted before, and I taste them and I'm like, wow, it's a really special and distinct thing that tastes like the place that it's from, which is really crucial to me in my understanding and love of wine.
Back to the sort of career progression side of things. From the bottle shop in Bayswater, what happened next?
Very early, I got a slot on local radio doing talkback every Saturday during cricket season, which was really inconvenient because I love the cricket. But we did that for 6 years. And talkback's really hard because people call in and they ask questions and you just don't know who they are or what they're going to ask. And I didn't sit there with a laptop to Google. So it was an incredibly important part of my learning and my skills, because you have to be sharp and on the ball all the time and learn to answer questions in a way that will give people what they want. But if you don't know the answer, you're not lying to them either. So I did that. I had a newspaper column, entered every competition that I could in terms of upskilling, I suppose, and surrounding myself with people that were cleverer than me, more experienced than me, and better than me. I did WSET 1, 2, and 3, which was good. Different pathway, I think, of learning that is less relevant to me now, but I'm glad that I have that sort of under the belt. I don't know, I sort of threw myself at anything and everything, and then moved to a really fine wine store in Cottesloe, which is a beachside suburb here, and was exposed to the great wines of the world. And that's really where I went from looking just at Australian wines and understanding those to looking at wines of Burgundy, Champagne, Rhone, Barolo. That's where I learned to love that. And you know, in Germany, Riesling. There's so many things that I learnt there that shaped the way that I perceive Australian wine, for better and for worse. It was great.
And was that a really steep learning curve?
That was the hardest thing I've ever done. And I love it. And I still look back on it. I'm still friends with them. I had coffee with them yesterday. It was a really good part of my life, but a really intensive, like 60-hour weeks, tasting several times a week, tasting wine during the day, every day, on the floor, serving wine and talking to people about wine in the restaurant. So it was a really big, very big part of my life. I loved it. It sort of supported my love of wine and emphasized it too, encouraged it.
Well, that's great. And presumably surrounded by people then who were helpful to you.
Yeah. I think what I really learned about wine during that time is how much I love this industry just so deeply, because it's really built on generosity. And what we know as wine people is that if you have a beautiful bottle of wine, it's way better shared because you can talk about it. And so wine people tend to call other wine people and say, hey, I've got this bottle, I want to open it. Do you want to drink it with me? I mean, that is very different to other industries, other creative industries. And I really value that. And Perth's very warm and kind of open, you know. So it was just this most amazing, eye-opening thing. Yeah, awesome.
From those early days, do you remember any sort of landmarks on that journey to really understanding the world of fine wine?
It was Montrachet, 2 tastings.
It would be Montrachet, wouldn't it?
It was, but we did 2 tastings in 2014, one in August and one in October, one with 15 wines from Montrachet and Le Montrachet, and the second with 11 wines from Montrachet and Le Montrachet, and we put them all on the table together. I think there was 10 people invited to each. And that was really where I was like, holy shit, Chardonnay. Like, I love Chardonnay already, but in terms of depth and complexity and length and like thundering presence, this is where I started to understand the dimension of excellence that occurs in great wines. Red Burgundy that Bill Pannell opened for me, the Henri Jaille Cros Parentout, you know, a wine way ahead of my station in terms of what I was able to critically perceive, I suppose, but something that just gave me so many things to, like little notes for me to go back and research and understand and kind of fostered my love for it.
Yeah, well, when I was speaking to Andrea Pritzker last week, she mentioned that, you know, it's not just a one-way linear path as well. So obviously you're talking about hitting some absolute pinnacles there, but I guess the pathways sort of mentally and sensorially, those dimensions that you get from those amazing wines, they don't just lead you to, well, that's all I can have from now on. It's much more that they open the door to possibilities and things that you can now be aware of in other places.
But you know, like, you taste Australian Chardonnay and you know it's great. You know it's really, really great. And then you taste it against Burgundy and you're like, wow, that's so different, but also so great. And what I remember thinking when I tasted those Montrachets is these are amazing. They're so different to what we have here. Like, are they astronomically better than the best wines that we have here? I don't know about that. And that was a very good learning for me because I was absolutely unequivocally bowled over by those wines. But, you know, in the first tasting that we had, every single bottle of Bouchard, or perhaps bar one, was oxidized, and same with Blanc-Gagnard. And it left me thinking, well, you know, shit, if we were drinking Australian Chardonnays, which are mostly under screw cap, we wouldn't be having this problem, would we? I mean, that's not a quality comment, that's a closure comment, but just little things, little learnings that you take away. You know, it wasn't just all I'm going to drink from now on is Montrachet, like, you know.
And also, I suppose, one great wine, it can be a pinnacle, of course, but then it can only be one great wine. It can't have everything that every other wonderful wine can have. And let's go back to your life as a critic then. When did you wake up and just say, I am a critic now?
So I was writing that wine column from 2013, and that was an every week project and something that I really threw myself into. And people would walk into the shop with my column like cut out, be like, I want to buy this wine, have you got it? You know, so it was kind of cool. Like, sometimes I'd have to order them in. I didn't have them. I'd found the wine and loved it and think, God, I haven't actually thought about how to sell this yet. You know, can't sell it for whatever reason. But it was nice to know that people read the notes. A couple of years ago, I was speaking to my teacher who taught me WCT 1 and 2. And he said, you always said you were going to be a wine critic. Now, I don't remember that. But I think that the answer is it was always embedded in me early. I loved the writing and I loved the tasting. And so that was a simple thing. I took the plunge as full-time wine writing, i.e. quit all of my jobs and just wrote and supported my family on writing at the very beginning of 2020. Actually, right as COVID was announced and we were in lockdown for the first time, I resigned from my job, which is crazy. But I've never looked back, ever. Now it's a very different situation. At that time, I was working for the Wine Companion. I was still hustling other wine jobs. I was writing for other magazines and doing pieces here and there whilst I was writing for the Companion. And then at the end of 2021, I got a text message on Instagram, actually, from William Kelley, who was the deputy editor of the Wine Companion at the time, but is now the editor-in-chief. And he messaged me and said, do you want to work for the Advocate? And I was like, I mean, yeah, I'd love to. But in my mind, I thought they were just asking for a few articles here and there, but that is not how the Advocate operates at all. And so when I met with Joe Savinsky, who was the editor-in-chief at the time, and said, I'm so glad that you've asked me because I'd love to write for you guys and I can still write for the Companion for WA. And he just laughed at me and was like, that's not how we do it. I'm going to have to give up everything. I had to give up everything to write for the Advocate. But I very much view my role in the industry as how can I be of service to it, and I can affect more positive change on a bigger platform, I believe, than I could ever have achieved just internally within Australia. So that was my thinking, and yeah, I haven't looked back.
What is your title now?
So I am reviewer for Australia and New Zealand. At the time, it was just Australia because Joe was still reviewing New Zealand. Like, the editor role is a really weighty one. There's a lot of work that they have to do. And so reviewing has to be pared down. And you've seen that with William Kelley and the reduction in his tasting workload. Certainly, by all means, does not mean his actual workload. But so Joe had to give up New Zealand. And so I took it because, Australia and New Zealand, what a joy. Yeah, I'm the first Australian writer to be employed full-time by the Advocate. And that was a big deal, I think, for Australia to have a local writer. It's really important.
It really is important to have those wines prominently feature in other markets and to be taken seriously with the track record that wines are being looked at over a period of time, the way that the producers perform, but also what they're doing and where they're going with things, rather than just what lands in the bottle, how it got there as well. So the responsibility of being the wine advocate critic, did it never really feel too much of a burden? I don't know.
Oh, it's terrifying. And like in the months leading up to the appointment, I was like, how am I going to sleep at night? Because there are, of course, producers that have traditionally scored really well with the Advocate in line with a different palate, and I don't share that enthusiasm for that style of wine, and so how do you take yourself out of the review and review them just solely on the quality of the wine? And is it possible to do that? And do the readers want that? Think about who I follow as wine writers, and what I want is to know that they're consistent, because I can benchmark my palate against theirs. Someone commented on my YouTube channel a while ago, I know I'm not going to like that wine because you like a lighter style of red than I do, and I like something bigger, so I'm not going to like it. And I was like, well, that's actually an amazing compliment, because what he said is that I'm consistently choosing wines of a particular style, and he knows with his palate that that's not going to suit him. So I've done my job in that regard, or at least as far as I see it. It was really scary also going from the Companion to the Advocate, because the Advocate is a much lower scoring platform, because we have this very strong internal coherency between regions. And so if we think about Australian Chardonnay, again, to talk about that same topic, those scores have to make sense in Burgundy. I can't be dishing out 93s and 94s all the time, knowing that William Kelley's giving the, Bellage Rouleau, which we all froth on and can't get enough of, he's giving that 91 points. So how do you make that make sense in Australia? That's a very big, difficult thing to do, because producers want high scores. I get it. Everyone wants high scores. But if you give away the high scores so easily, they don't make any sense to consumers, because you think, why would I jump at a 96-point wine? There's heaps of them. That's like the average score, So that was a very long process to start to ease people into a accepted scoring coherency within Australia, because I'm still an Australian. So I'm giving, in an Australian context, lower scores, I think, than many platforms. But in a global context, they're still quite high. I'm still working on it. It's hard.
I bet it is. I'm sure people look at you in your role with responsibility and being an articulate, intelligent person, and you're obviously asked to do a lot of things where you're quite exposed. Do you feel like you're a confident person, like everyone would assume you are?
Up until I became an adult, i.e. 5 years ago, I don't think that I ever second-guessed myself at all, ever, because it's just not how I was raised, and it's not who I was. Understanding now that the words that I use and the way that I use them has a direct and potentially lasting impact on the people that I'm speaking about has absolutely caused me to second guess myself and to make sure that everything's checked. I still slip up because I say things because I'm opinionated and because I'm open, I still say things and then think, probably could have worded that a little more diplomatically. I don't believe ever in being dishonest about anything, but equally, I also hate it when people are rude, and I hate being rude. I really hate it. And so delivering truth in a way that's diplomatic and constructive is really something that I take very seriously. And it's not very sexy or cool to be like that, but I respect it when other people are like that. I saw a thing that Warren Buffett did. It was an interview. And he was like, what you should do is sit down with a pen and paper and write down the 5 things you admire most in other people. And then you should look at that list and you need to make those things your own. And I was like, oh, that's awesome. Honesty, integrity, kindness, intelligence, humor. You know, they're 5 things I really care about. And so I try and do that every day in my job. Well, it's hard though.
I'd say you're nailing it. I think the sense of integrity and thoughtfulness that it sounds like you brought to your writing from day one, the idea that there was more contained in it than just the judgment. You say you didn't second guess yourself, but you're obviously putting a lot of thought into it in the first place. And I think that speaks volumes as well in terms of not being diplomatic, but just giving context. And within that context, of course, there needs to be kindness and a certain amount of respect for what you're looking at. Of course, it's never going to be just about the person giving the verdict. So I think that that's probably something that should provide some reassurance to you as well.
Thank you. I've started in the last couple of years seeing things in wines that I don't like and thinking it's very easy to just write a review and say this is shit, this vintage. And that happens. You see it in the newspaper with restaurant reviews. You see it with other critics. I don't think it's the right thing to do. And so I've been contacting producers and saying, by the way, I've noticed this about your wine. Have you noticed this about your wine? They might say yes or no. And I'll say, I'm not going to review it for this reason. I don't like it because of this reason, but I actually don't think that it positively contributes to the Australian wine story, which I'm trying to curate. So I'm leaving it out. Don't take it personally. And most people are really grateful that that has happened. You know, Australia has a long way to go globally in order to build the reputation externally that reflects the quality that we're producing. And so it's very unhelpful to be publishing reviews that don't reflect excellence here. That's not to say I only write nice things, but it is to say that I focus on wines that are of a certain quality and regionality and expressiveness of their terroir.
What are the kind of things that you'd like just a regular wine drinker who doesn't necessarily consume wine media to think about or enjoy when it comes to their interactions with wine and people?
I think I really want people to think about where it came from and why they're drinking it. I give a lot of wine away to the parents at school because obviously I've got a heavy excess of bottles every week that I need to move on. And I've actually got probably 100 bottles on the floor down there that I forgot to text out the other week. So they're all there. I need to tip them down the drain, which is annoying. But the parents will say, oh, I loved those wines last night. I don't know why I liked them though. And I'm like, well, the gateway into understanding wine discernment is yes or no. Do you like it? Do you not like it? The next question to ask yourself is why you like it or why you don't like it, knowing that nothing when it comes to your preference is wrong, maybe uninformed, but not wrong. And so that's a really interesting thing because sometimes I'll be like, oh, I really liked it. It felt really smooth. And I'm like, okay, you're probably going to like these wines. And so then they move on and try these wines. And to me, I know that sounds really simple and basic, but actually giving people a small bit of understanding about why they might like it and therefore how they can like other things like it and then learn is a really important part of why I write notes. And that's how I started learning. You know, I would taste all these wines and be like, early, I was like, I like Barossa Shiraz because lots of people like Barossa Shiraz when they start because it's sweet, you know. And so then I was like, well, if I like Barossa, I might try Shiraz from like McLaren Vale and see how I like that. I was like, wow, I really like this. Move into like Shiraz from somewhere else and go, oh, I don't like it as much, but why? But why? And so that's how you do it. Little sideways steps that move you around the board. And that's what I hope people get from tasting notes, is that they like it because.
I have commented before that I sometimes wonder whether there is actually only one Erin Larkin because I'm not sure how this person can fit this much into their life. There probably is no such thing as a regular week, but could you give me an idea of what a roughly regular week in the life of renowned global wine critic Erin Larkin might look like?
I try and keep the weeks pretty simple when I'm at home because we do have two young boys, 7 and 6, and I have a husband and a social life, which is often put on hold. But I will taste all day on Tuesday and Wednesday without fail. When I'm in town, that happens. I have a woman who comes and tastes with me, Wendy Roach, who's amazing, and she tasted with me all through the Companion. And I met her through Peter Forrestal in the very early days of me learning how to taste wine. She's been tasting it for at least 30 years longer than I have. And she has a deep love of organisation, so she unpacks everything and sets everything up for me. So Wendy and I taste on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. If I can fit in another 2 days of tasting on Thursdays and Fridays, I do. Mondays, I try and keep for admin, answering emails, although, the person I emailed from Margaret River this morning, who emailed me in August 2024, would probably beg to differ on that. But I try and do like admin-y stuff on Mondays, and then travel. And the travel's a really big part because the Advocate is really very, very keen on the reviewers visiting the regions, standing in the vineyards, smelling the dirt and the place, talking to people, which is cool. But it takes a lot of time to organise those trips, and it takes a lot of time to do them. So on top of the tasting, I often do less events than I used to, although later in the year that usually ramps up around July to November. I travel for about 110 days a year, which doesn't include last minute stuff. It doesn't include stuff in WA, and lots of tastings at night times. I'm part of 4 wine groups, so we meet each month. And so that's just kind of exposure to other people's tastes and interesting kind of in-depth tastings that we choose to do. That's really cool. I like doing those things. I do a lot of show judging as well. I sort of do 8 a year, which I love. It's hard, but I love it. I'm a bit of a glutton for it all, really. I find it difficult to say no to do new things because it's kind of just an opportunity to taste more and to talk more to people about what they're doing.
Excellent. It's an incredible level of output.
I always feel like I could do more, though. I'm always racked by guilt. I could be doing more.
See about that, and especially not when people bug you to be part of their podcasts.
No, I love it.
Speaking of podcasts, I did see a couple of days ago that on a rival podcast, I'm going to call it a rival podcast, even though it's existed much longer than this 2-week-old one, that they had asked the question about who would be your ideal person to have a drink of wine with, and I just got off the phone to you when I saw this, and at the very top of that list a reader had replied, "My absolute dream would be to have a glass of wine with Erin Larkin." Which makes me want to ask you, cool. Who would be the person that you'd like to have a glass of wine with?
Oh God, what a question, Ed.
That's hard. I don't know what I'd answer.
I don't know. No, it's hard because you know what I do when I think of that. I think of all the cool people I've already had glasses of wines with. And it really depends on why. Like, do I want to sit around with my best friends and drink wine because we're having a good time together? Do I want to sit with William Kelley and get like a history lesson coupled with dark humour kind of intellect as well? Do I want to sit with people that are just crazy wealthy and interesting and doing things that are just out of this world different? Or I don't know. I'm in a fortunate position to be able to meet a lot of cool people and drink with them as part of the job. So it's one of the great pleasures of my job is to get to know people.
So we'll just move back where we started a bit more, not Perth so much as WA on the whole. It's a subject that if there are listeners to this podcast, they might not know as much as they could, and they certainly won't know as much as you. You've been, I think, for a couple of years, the Swan Valley Wine Show chair. What would you say we need to know about what's going on the ground in Swan Valley?
I think most certainly it's fortified. I know that sounds like old news because no one drinks fortified anymore. But the best from the Swan are among the best in Australia, and that puts them among the best in the world. They are completely distinct to the place, incredibly rich, just kaleidoscopically complex, long relics of the past, and I just find them unendingly fascinating and pleasurable to drink. The fortified class at Swan Valley is one of the great joys of show judging anywhere. I'm judging at Rutherglen later this year, so I'll come back to you on that, but very, very much in love with the Swan. I've actually judged there on and off for 10 years. The dry whites are something that I think the Swan is not necessarily known for, but should be. The Verdelho and Chenin Blanc, especially when blended. Although the varietal Chenin from the Swan is really something incredibly age-worthy and impressive. But those dry whites, man, they're good. The Horton white Burgundy, when that started so many decades ago, was Australia's #1 selling white wine.
It was an absolute go-to to me when I first arrived in Australia as well, that wine.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Suited my budget, and it's a lovely drink.
And they age really well because they're mainly Chenin Blanc. But they, I think, are a really important part of West Australia and Australia's history, being dry as well and not overripe and all those great things. Yeah, and Grenache. Grenache is everyone's talking about Grenache in Australia. We get that. McLaren Vale is doing magical things. Barossa has always been doing it, and they're doing better and better every year. She had the most amazing Eden Valley Grenache last night. Oh, my God.
May I ask, who was that from?
It was the Thistledown. Actually, no, that was the Blewett Springs, but their Eden Valley Grenache was equal points, but I gave the bottle away.
That's all right. It would probably be oxidised.
You got to buy some. So good, 24. But yeah, Swan.
And you've probably seen a bit of a progression over that 10 years as well.
I think people are really refining. I think viticulture is a really big deal. I mean, the Swan Valley is potentially Australia's hottest wine region. And if we're talking about climate change, Western Australia particularly has been seeing a huge decline in rainfall, although I know South Australia had a particularly difficult 2025 lead into that as well in the 24 season. So I think a decline in rainfall and increasing temperatures means that viticulture has become all important. And so the dry grown unirrigated vineyards, interestingly, are the ones that are going very well. I think those old vines have got their roots deep into the soil and can weather seasonal variation a little better than vineyards that rely on irrigation. So that's been a huge thing, is more of a sensitivity around suitable varieties and not trying to force square pegs into round holes, I think that's probably it, that the Swan is really starting to harness its potential with very specific grape varieties rather than just trying to do everything, which it cannot do.
So we'll go from a little bit of an underdog there to the perennial mega overachiever of Margaret River. It's such a flag bearer of quality, blessed with an awful lot of favourable vintages. Not, of course, every year, and nothing's easy in wine anyway, we should remember that. But what a region. What do you think of it?
I love Margaret River. I have such a deep affection for the place and for the people. I am finding that I'm becoming more critical of them and their work, but I think it's sort of like when you are critical of your kids and you just want them, what they're capable of and you want them to be better. I think that the quality of the fruit resource in Margaret River is unbelievable, and we use a term world class, but it truly is. And the good thing about it is it tastes exactly like Margaret River. It doesn't taste like fruit from Yarra or fruit from Tas or Mornington or Adelaide Hills. It tastes like Margaret River, and that's one of the great things about it, actually. And I think that the style of Chardonnay and Cabernet, and they're really the two varieties that I talk about when I'm talking about the region, it grows everything well. And actually, I think plantings of Chardonnay and Cabernet might account for only like 30% of total plantings in Margaret River. There's a lot of Shiraz, a lot of Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon. But those two varieties in that place really excel. And stylistically, producers and viticulturists are refining it. There's been a lot of grafting and replanting, change of pruning methods for sap flow. There's been, change to organic viticulture and biodynamic viticulture. It's a really wonderful place. And as you say, lots of the vintages are very good. It's quite a consistent climate. Three sides of ocean will do that. It's moderating. But it's a magnificent place. And lest we forget, barely 60 years old. So, hundreds of years ahead of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Great Southern, I mean, a big area.
The size of Belgium.
That's right. So many good wines of various different stripes coming out of Great Southern. And I know you're very fond of that. I mean, how could you not be? Where should people be making sure to cast their eye when they're looking at that vast region?
So there's two ways to look at it. Riesling, from a variety perspective, Riesling, you're going to Franklin River, you're going to Parongarup, Totline, both of those places, incredible. I love the purity and the chalky finesse of Parongarup, and I love the austere, tightly coiled power of Franklin River. If you're traveling from a tourist perspective, you have to go to Denmark because it's incredibly beautiful. The coastline, the carry trees, the vineyards, Chardonnay and Pinot down there. And then you have the reds of Franklin River and Mount Barker. And these are very, very structural, ferruginous, powerful wines, but they're powerful from the ground, not from the making, and that's what makes them so great. I don't know if I can say this, and I probably can, but I have a tasting coming up, which will be the largest single vineyard tasting in West Australia's history, and it's of the Swinney Vineyard in Franklin River, because it's a huge estate. And so I want to look at all the wines made from fruit grown there, red or white, regardless of style, because I want to know, does the ground trump the maker? Or is it evident in a variety of different hands, or are the hands able to erase the place? And I don't think the last one's true, but I'd like to see it on this spectrum. I did something similar last year with the Hoffman Vineyard in the Barossa. We looked at 93 wines from the Hoffman Vineyard, and that was unreal. I mean, looking at the volume of wine, but Adrian had sorted those wines out for me in blocks, vineyard blocks. So this producer buys from these blocks, and this is what these taste like. And so we're looking at it from the ground up. So Franklin River is a pretty spectacular place, very, very remote and very vast feeling and very distinct. I love the Great Southern.
I think it's beautiful. And that Hoffman thing must be quite interesting, because they only get about 3 grapes per hectare on that.
Yeah, right. And yet, there's a lot of people making a lot of wine from it. There's a lot of ground. I think it's something like 150 hectares. Anyway, yeah, amazing.
And 2 more questions. One, just generally speaking, outside of WA, and we can go as global as you like, what are the things at the moment that you really can't wait to hear the names of when someone brings a bottle of wine to one of your tastings?
That's interesting. Usually at the moment I'm looking for older bottles, and most of the things that I want to see are older Australian wines, because I think we have the propensity in wine to just go straight to Burgundy, which is great. You know, all roads do end in Burgundy, and that's great. But what we forget is that we have this very rich vinous history in Australia, and we touched on it when we did Len Evans, and we looked at all of those graceful old Australian wines. And to me, they were the most emotional wines of the week. You know, lots of Rousseau, lots of DRC, lots of Donhoff and Koch, and all those amazing wines that we just were like, wow, isn't this good? But then you look at those wines from Australia from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and honestly, that just opened me up. And so when people bring old Australian bottles, that's when I'm like, wow, this is everyone sit down, everyone shut up. We have these beautiful old wines. Let's just take a moment to appreciate them, because I think there's so few bottles of them around, you know. They're so rare. They're truly rare.
They are. And they were, as you say, really memorable and emotional, and, you know, that they do that wonderful thing of really transporting you somewhere. On a final note, what do you think you might fancy a tipple of tonight?
I know exactly what it is. It's the rest of that Thistledown bottle. So we're going camping tonight with our caravan and our boys at our block, and so I'll be taking wine down there for us to drink during and after dinner. We're going to finish the Thistledown during dinner, and it'll probably be a bottle of Chardonnay after that, and it will be Australian Chardonnay, because that's what I have the most of, and that's what I tend to drink most days. So
lovely. That's it for this week's podcast. If you like what you heard, please like it, subscribe, pass it on. All that means so much. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmarison.substack.com. Comments are massively welcome. Please let me know what you'd like to hear more of. In the meantime, huge thanks to my friends Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, and to my guest, Erin Larkin. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.